Hi guys, it's Mark Zickery, Mr. Sci-Fi. Hope you're all staying safe and having a life that's wonderful. And we're here busy working on Space Command and Sweet Haven, and I'm writing the new book, Greenlighting Yourself, and tons of stuff that I'll talk about in great detail soon. But, and I'm going to be posting a number of Mr. Sci-Fi videos over the next few days because stuff has been piling up that I've wanted to talk about. But for now, I just wanted to talk very briefly about two of my favorite writers and the interesting ways that writers were defined in the 50s and 60s into the 70s, 80s, in fact, the end of the 20th century and beyond. Most science fiction writers stayed in what was known as the science fiction ghetto. And for most of them, they might earn a penny a word writing a short story, or a nickel or a dime. They might earn $1,000 for a novel, or $3,000. Ultimately, some of them got into much better money, like Arthur C. Clarke, Isaac Asimov, Robert A. Heinlein. But a few managed to redefine their careers, where even though they were still writing a lot of science fiction, they were viewed much more as mainstream writers. There's a handful of these, and it's very, very interesting to look at their careers. Michael Crichton wrote a number of science fiction novels, and yet he was categorized as a mainstream writer. And Ray Bradbury, of course, managed to become the great mainstream and fantasy and science fiction writer. So he was really one of a kind, a unique career. But I want to talk today about Kurt Vonnegut Jr. Now, Kurt Vonnegut Jr. Is a writer who came to prominence after World War II, and he's a wonderful writer. He wrote, if you've never heard of him, look him up and definitely read his work. It's terrific. He wrote Slaughterhouse-Five, which is a brilliant, brilliant book. Many other great books, Breakfast of Champions, etc. But I wanted to talk about how he was a science fiction writer who actually was not perceived as such. So this is one of his books, Cat's Cradle. And most people think of him as this mustachioed, long-haired guy, sort of a Mark Twain clone, but this is what he looked like in the early days. So very, very different. And but interestingly enough, of the 14 novels he wrote, fully half of them, 7, were science fiction. Player Piano, Sirens of Titan, Cat's Cradle, Slaughterhouse-Five, Slapstick, Galapagos, and Timequake. And they dealt with very accepted science fiction tropes. For instance, future dystopias, end of the world stories, space travel, also, time travel, all sorts of stuff. And but beyond that, he created a character who was in both his science fiction novels, and these were all promoted and sold for the most part as mainstream novels. I mean, early on, Player Piano and Sirens of Titan were sold as science fiction primarily, but from basically Cat's Cradle, Slaughterhouse-Five on, Mother Night, etc., these were marketed as mainstream novels, not as science fiction, not in the genre. And Vonnegut had a strange love-hate relationship with the science fiction world and with science fiction writers. First of all, any writer who could, it made a great sense to try and move out of the genre simply for economic reasons. Vonnegut, as a mainstream writer, was making a lot more than your average science fiction writer of the same period. But it was very, very funny because he came up in the genre, he knew a number of the genre writers, and had actually even attended some of the science fiction conventions. And so he created his own fictional science fiction writer. Now, this is very, very interesting because many science fiction writers identified with this character, and some of them even felt that, for instance, that he was modeled on them. For instance, Philip Jose Farmer wrote a book based where he, as Kilgore Trout, that many people thought Vonnegut had written, but it was actually pseudonymously written by Philip Jose Farmer, and it was called Venus on the Half Shell, and it came out in the 70s. And Philip Jose Farmer was a very, well-known science fiction writer of the 50s through to about the end of the 20th century. And but the character that Vonnegut created was a writer named Kilgore Trout. Now, the writer, of course, who inspired that name was a friend of mine and a mentor and a terrific writer. Often Vonnegut when talking about science fiction, would say, well, science fiction has a lot of big ideas but really bad writing. And in many cases, this was true. But in the case of this one writer, it wasn't. And so I wanted to mention this writer. Now, if you see, his name is Theodore Sturgeon, and this is one of his books, A Way Home. and he was a friend of mine and a mentor to me. And in fact, my photograph of him appears on 2 of his books. And he was a terrific writer and genuinely viewed as a terrific writer. But I think that Vonnegut must have realized that Theodore Sturgeon was innately a humorous name, and so he then came up with Kilgore Trout. Theodore, Kilgore, Sturgeon, Trout, get it? And and so throughout a number of his books, Kilgore Trout was sort of this rumpled, impoverished science fiction writer, basically unknown, who came up with all of these bizarre stories that Vonnegut would relate in synopsis or in passing, but not have to write the full novels. And he moved through many of Vonnegut's books as this increasingly older and rumpled character. And so it's actually fascinating. And recently, interestingly enough, I thought it would be fun if anyone had collected the stories of Kilgore Trout that were related in Vonnegut's books, and I actually was able to find them online. So I may put a link down below this video to so you can look at them yourself. But anyway, I just thought I wanted to share some of that. Vonnegut is an amazing writer, a wonderful writer, and by the way, he and Kilgore Trout are very wry and very funny and very ironic and very acerbic, and there's a very, very, there's a voice that runs through both the Kurt Vonnegut stories and the Kilgore Trout stories that's Vonnegut's voice. Whereas Sturgeon was not a cynic. He was not wry in that same way. He was not acerbic. Ted was a very, he actually attended our wedding, among other things, and he was a very dear man, a very loving man, very interested in human foibles, but a very different kind of writer. He wrote some novels that were very well received. The Dreaming Jewels, More Than Human, but my personal favorites are his short stories. He wrote a great short story called A Touch of Loneliness that I highly recommend. It was made into a less good Twilight Zone episode when they brought the Twilight Zone back in the 80s. But Ted really is a phenomenal writer, and I think his work really stands the test of time. So in conclusion, if you haven't read Vonnegut, definitely read Vonnegut. I mean, some of my favorites of his books, my personal favorites, I love Mother Night. I think God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater is a lot of fun. Breakfast of Champions is a wonderful book. I like Slaughterhouse-Five is one of the great classic novels of the 20th century. Sirens of Titan is a lot of fun. Cat's Cradle is a lot of fun. Timequake I like very much. But all of his novels have a lot to offer. And as for Ted Sturgeon, they've put together his collected works in a series of volumes that you can find for not much money on eBay, and I highly recommend them. They're also, I'm sure, on Amazon. And so that's about it for now. If you want to support Mr. Sci-Fi and Space Command, go to patreon.com/Mark Zicree and pledge some money. It really helps. Every little bit helps. And there's Space Command t-shirts you can buy below and all sorts of stuff. And we're still selling Space Command shares. You can contact me at markzicree@gmail.com for that information. And you can watch Space Command on Mr. Sci-Fi, if you go around looking on the different posts, in addition to the Star Trek episode I did with George Takei and Christina Moses. So it's all here on Mr. Sci-Fi. And so from my universe to yours, stay well, stay safe, and we'll talk again real soon. Bye, guys.